Everyone's wondering, will you come out tonight? Everyone's trying to get it right. Get it right. Everybody's working for the weekend. Do 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 do. Everybody wants a new romance. Everybody's going off the deep end. Do 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 do. Everybody wants a second chance. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And now that we've wrapped up our review of Final Destination Bloodlines, it's time to get down and dirty to unpack the second half of this officially recommended double feature, a production that I personally found far more disturbing and existentially dreadful than almost any recent horror movie, that film, of course, being Hurry Up Tomorrow, a musical-tinged psychological thriller that sees R&B and neo-synth-pop sensation Abel Tesfaye, aka The Weeknd, making his feature film debut as a fictionalized version of himself, this project serving as a companion piece to his latest album of the same name, which was already released in late January of this year. Tesfaye has been working on both the album and this film for the better part of 2 years, although both album and film had reportedly seen something of a major creative overhaul in the fall of 2022 when Tesfaye was forced to cancel the intended final performance of his After Hours Till Dawn tour after losing his voice on stage due, again, reportedly to severe psychological rather than physical stress. In the film Hurry Up Tomorrow, Tesfaye portrays himself as a hard-partying but personally adrift pop star whose similar incident of losing his voice while performing is foregrounded by the tumultuous end of a relationship with an unnamed woman who he is still obsessed with and heartbroken over. The film opens with a moody, experiential sequence of abstract light and color playing across the screen as Tesfaye listens to the voicemail left by his recent ex, who accuses him of being a fundamentally bad person, alluding to horrible things he said and did in the course of their relationship that destroyed her faith in herself, and finally declaring that Tesfaye deserves to be alone forever. The fictionalized Tesfaye, despite his clearly extensive and hectic touring schedule, maladaptively treats his depression with drugs and alcohol, and at the fanatical encouragement of his friend and manager Lee is played by Barry Keoghan, but the concert incident culminates in Tesfaye ditching the venue in humiliation, only to run into an obsessed fan and runaway named Anima, played by Jenna Ortega. Tesfaye becomes quickly infatuated with Anima. They spend the night together at Coney Island and then hide out in a hotel where, before going to bed together, Tesfaye begs Anima, "Never leave me." The next morning, however, the previously desperately anxious Tesfaye is completely emotionally cold and distant, seemingly thoroughly prepared to ditch Anima and proceed with business as usual on the international leg of his tour. An argument ensues during which Anima clubs Tesfaye over the head with a wine bottle, and which then sends this already stressful, chaotic narrative spiraling into new dimensions of obsession and the bizarre, as Anima is revealed to be something slightly more dangerous than your run-of-the-mill doe-eyed groupie, and something slightly less than a fawning idolater of The Weeknd and his art. Hurry Up Tomorrow is co-written with Tesfaye, as well as directed and edited by Trey Edward Schultz, who most audiences will probably still know as being one of the many also-ran auteurs who made their bones with the advent of the so-called elevated horror cycle, with Schultz himself writing and directing It Comes at Night, a post-apocalyptic survival thriller that nonetheless saw the young upstart establishing himself as a credible artisan of exactly the sorts of more experiential, more psychologically driven genre films that had typified so much of most high-profile horror horror in the mid to late 2010s. But even before it comes at night, which in my opinion at least is already one of the more impressive and aesthetically creative debuts of the elevated horror boom, Schultz had already made a much smaller name for himself with the psychological drama called Krisha, which, not unlike his latest, much more high-profile mainstream project, saw Schultz working very intimately with his real-life aunt to portray a fictionalized version of herself, with the rest of his nuclear and extended family rounding out the cast, lending his less narratively conventional film an air of experiential credibility as it attempted to portray the seemingly omnipresent anxiety, desperation, and stress experienced by its protagonist. Preceding Hurry Up Tomorrow, Schultz's only other feature film was the 2019 Waves, which again is a psychological drama, that one dealing with a wealthy high school sports star whose obsession with his ex-girlfriend spirals out of control with not incidental help from a lot of drugs, alcohol, and an atmosphere of ephemeral toxic masculinity. See if you can spot some more parallels here. Now, I happen to think Trey Edward Schultz is one of the best American auteurs working today. In the past 10 years, he's built up a body of work that, and with reservations, I'm including Hurry Up Tomorrow with it, that demonstrates a great facility with crafting works that are primarily experiential and mood-based, which makes his foregrounding of themes of psychological extremes and especially stress and desperation much more deeply felt and credible seeming than a lot of filmmakers that I think primarily cynically traffic in the affect of interest in human psychology, when what they're really interested in is just ostentatious displays of stylization, and often without Schultz's technical mastery to boot. But more than just so consistently and impressively portraying studies and characters who are alternately desperate or self-sabotaging or adrift, Schultz's films are demonstrative of what might very well be a new, definitive cycle of cinema to emerge among his generational cohort of American filmmakers, which I like to call the stress film. Alongside the Safdie brothers, Alex Ross Perry, Sean Baker, and Janicza Bravo, as well as others, Schultz has been instrumental in defining a trend in millennial independent cinema in which the primary mood they seek to inspire is not even so much suspense or psychological dread as it is just stress. Just a sense of always impending disaster and doom as their lonely characters, largely through their own seeming pathological drive towards their own worst maladaptive tendencies, spiral deeper and deeper into scenarios of danger and self-destruction. It's been interesting seeing the broadly negative popular and critical response to Hurry Up Tomorrow as primarily a vanity piece for Tesfaye, as basically a plodding, glorified commercial for his latest album, and look, the jokes practically write themselves. Hurry Up Tomorrow, more like hurry up and be over already, am I right? And I'm gonna be the last person to tell you that Hurry Up Tomorrow, isn't a vanity project. Let's face it, this is a film that literally doesn't exist without Tesfaye as a co-writer and star, without his own clearly deep investment in not merely expanding his creative potential into film, but in foregrounding himself and his own recent experiences, his own patterns of addiction and toxic relationships with women, as a subject worthy of a nearly 2-hour self-portrait elaboration. There's even an allusion in the film itself to the fictionalized Tesfaye's attempt to break into acting as not working out. And given that the narrative of the film comes to hinge upon the contrivance of Tesfaye running afoul of an obsessed fan, or anti-fan as it might turn out, there's no getting around how his ego is plastered all over every minute of Hurry Up Tomorrow, even in the lengths he and Schultz's story goes to characterizing this fictionalized version of himself as not just a flawed person, but kind of a bad, superficial, and ultimately hollow person. But then that gets into the terrain of things where I think a lot of people are kind of writing off Hurry Up Tomorrow quite unfairly, both even as a vanity project for Tesfaye, as well as an example of collaborator Trey Edward Schultz's own cinematic oeuvre. Hurry Up Tomorrow doesn't just portray the fictionalized Tesfaye as a lonely, overworked artist. From the very opening close-up of Tesfaye looking strung out and teary-eyed into the camera, blubbering his lips over and over again in a seemingly compulsive exercise before he goes into an exaggerated, hyper-masculine routine with Lee to get him amped up for a performance, lifting weights, Lee strapping on a guard belt and making Tesfaye box him, before we reach the stage and Tesfaye goes into what is effectively his only successful musical performance in the film. There is not only this investment in portraying how behind the scenes, how kind of ridiculous this character is, but setting up the pervading theme of the film, which is the incredible chasm between The Weeknd's music and his performances, these things that inspire such adulation and excitement, and when it comes to Ortega's character, even obsession with him or a persona of his. There is a huge chasm between Tesfaye's art and his personality, which is only compounded as we further witness not only his self-destructive behavior, but the way he reacts to and responds to rejection from this woman he supposedly cared for so deeply, that it's literally leading to such psychological stress that he can't any longer sing. Anybody writing off this film as merely a vanity project is watching a completely different movie. For one, there isn't even that much music from Tesfaye's companion album featured prominently in the film, with most of the sonic contribution to Hurry Up Tomorrow coming from composer Daniel Lopatin, and when it comes to Ortega's Anima character, getting more time to shine herself with a scene in which she does an impromptu lip-synced performance of two of Tesfaye's songs from previous records. Even Tesfaye's older music is featured more extensively in Hurry Up Tomorrow than the music from Hurry Up Tomorrow. For another, though, Tesfaye really is towing a fine line with this role in terms of what he can expect his audiences to conflate between this fictionalized version of himself and himself. Because if not for his behavior towards his ex, both the off-screen and honestly quite serious allusions that her voicemail suggests, not just about this character's words, but his behavior. If not for also his on-screen displays of obsessive controlling behavior that, quite frankly, clearly constitutes straight-up harassment. If not for all of that, once we reach that morning after point where the desperate, lonely, weepy, self-pitying Tesfaye is replaced by a cruel, disregarding, cold pop star who uses women when it's convenient for him and then casts them aside, Tesfaye's collaboration with Schultz on this psychologically intimate, often quite disturbing character study of a toxic male celebrity, to the extent that audiences, including myself, if I'm being honest, will inevitably conflate the fictionalized version of The Weeknd with the man himself. If this is a vanity project, it's a vanity project that borders upon self-assassination. Tesfaye's fictionalized version of himself, again, doesn't just come off as flawed, but a pathologically horrible person. Someone who at once bemoans his own lack of satisfaction in companionship, but then quite overtly manipulates women into relations with him, only so he can turn around and lash out against them when he's challenged, or worse yet, when they try to extricate themselves from his toxic influence. There's a reason that in my last review of Final Destination Bloodlines that I said that Hurry Up Tomorrow was ironically a rather perfect companion piece to a low-stakes, run-of-the-mill, fun Saturday night horror movie. The sort of movie that, despite the trappings of genre, is really intended more for a gallows laugh than anything that's really going to trigger your fear or apprehension. Hurry Up Tomorrow is the sort of movie I see that isn't a horror movie, but which I end up finding deeply, viscerally disturbing. And in its own way, Hurry Up Tomorrow is perhaps one of the most unalloyed and terrifying depictions of not only male celebrity, but indeed how men, and particularly wealthy and powerful men, can marshal superficial and grandiose displays of emotional vulnerability to mask their much more deeply pathological drive to manipulate, to control, and ultimately deeply harm others, particularly the women who falsely conflate the depth of their artistic creativity, their intuition about what works in a good pop track, with anything actually deep about their psychology and their emotions, anything actually honest about what they are looking for in companionship and how they go about getting it. Has our contemporary culture, with so many of its intersecting but popularly flattened preoccupations with themes of mental health, self-care, emotional vulnerability, identifying unresolved trauma, the so-called epidemic of male loneliness, and especially how the framing of toxic masculinity focuses more on how men treat themselves and other men as opposed to, how they culturally just kind of manipulate and abuse women? Hurry Up Tomorrow asks a very horrifying question about our times and how all of these very important mainstreamings of mental health topics are flattened and reduced to obvious cliches. Has our contemporary culture produced an environment in which rich, powerful, successful men can simply invoke the cliche of them being traumatized, lonely individuals, so that they can reframe the toxic consequences of their actions as fundamentally being about how poorly it reflects our vision of themselves, and not actually how their patterns of behavior, not their feelings, affect women? And has it done so to such an extent that these same rich, powerful, successful, toxic men feel comfortable exploiting these cliches in order to quietly exonerate themselves of the far less trenchant reality that their behavior speaks for itself, that they are deeply narcissistic, superficial, controlling, bad people? And what makes this vision all the more horrifying is precisely that I don't even know how much of it is intentional in the film. There's an extent to which, especially in the climax of Hurry Up Tomorrow, in which a sequence of grandiose, desperate apology on Tesfaye's part, once again using his musical talent as a tool for expressing something that might not even really be there underneath, only to end on a counterpoint, ambiguous note in which Tesfaye returns to exactly where he was at the start of the film and is looking at us with this obvious insinuation that, like in American Psycho, which was clearly a big influence on this film, especially Ortega's character and what she does as far as her performance and analysis of The Weeknd's music. There's this insinuation by the end of it that this confession has meant nothing, that this has all been a grandiose performance from which the only lesson is an oppressive, abysmal nihilism. And especially when you consider not what the fictionalized Tesfaye does on screen, but the potential for much worse things that the voicemail from his ex alludes to. It's at that point that you really, if you want to preserve any sense of your spirit, you kind of need to take a step away from it and cross your fingers that this really is more of a Schultz project. A stressful, deeply disturbing expose of the pathological and spiritual rot that lies behind all of that spectacle of romantic and desperate feeling and even the overtures of contrition. Except I'm watching Hurry Up Tomorrow, and instead, while counting the obvious ways that its premise is clearly a ripoff of all things, the 2005 psychological thriller Hard Candy, which is literally about a teenage runaway who takes a sexual predator hostage, I'm watching this movie and thinking about Bob Fosse's own self-portrait with all that jazz, and realizing there was a time when a great artist and filmmaker could be honest that his primary lover and companion is his art, but that he is otherwise a womanizer, a user, if not an abuser of women. Except all that jazz isn't a hysterical, desperate, almost last-ditch, get-out-ahead-of-any allegations apology for Fosse's character. He's just telling it like it is, without exaggerating the extent of the harm he has caused the women in his life, just so that he can turn the lens back on himself and devote even more obsession to himself. And look, obviously, I'm not saying times were better when men didn't ever think about their toxic patterns of behavior, when they weren't ever emotionally vulnerable, when they, especially rich and powerful and talented men, never interrogated their basic character. But I have to say, at least that classical archetype of a rich, powerful, talented man never acted like such a fucking crybaby. Such a mealy-mouthed, weepy jerk that buries their bad moral character under mountains of self-regarding, self-pitying bullshit, rather than just stating the obvious. Look, Abel. Fictional Abel. Let's make that clear. He can slander himself. I'm not taking that risk. Look, Abel. The reason you treat women the way you do is not because of depression. It's not because of loneliness. It's not because your father abandoned you and your mom. Let's at least look past the therapy and self-help cliches to just do some socially scientific controls. There are so many millions of men all over the world in every permutation of a fundamentally patriarchal society, many of whom come from way worse circumstances than you. And there are also so many millions of men all over the world in every permutation of a patriarchal order who have come from vastly more privileged and frictionless origins than yourself, all of whom treat women the exact same way. You don't treat women the way you do because of your anxious avoidant attachment style. You don't have toxic codependent relationships with women. You're just a dickhead who manipulates women to get pussy. That's it. And I'm not calling out anybody. I can say this as someone who's had to do a lot of his own self-work, I guess, as far as it regards my own major depressive disorder, my own anxious attachments to women, and I'm not here to make some hollow apology to anybody, because at a certain point I have to reckon with the unhappy realization that so much of depression, especially as so many men experience it in a patriarchal context, so much of our depression is just obverse of what is fundamentally a narcissistic self-regard. We are sad and lonely and hard on ourselves because, to a certain extent, we are obsessed with ourselves, and not even our own needs, but our desires. Just as we build up sex and companionship with women into these discrete objects of desire that only puts women on stressful, precarious pedestals only for us to knock them down when they inevitably displease or reject that fantasy, we also exaggerate and build up our own sense of what is our underlying spiritual motivations for engaging in toxic masculine patterns. Because that's how patriarchy encourages us to think. That, like the famous Lit song, I'm my own worst enemy. In the aftermath of P. Diddy and Kanye West and Andrew Cuomo and Harvey Weinstein, nobody needs Abel Tesfaye engaging in this heightened apology for all the groupies he's love-bombed. The one kernel of truth of archetypal masculinity that we should still preserve as men is that there are just some scenarios where you suck it up, stop pitying yourself, stop being a crybaby, and do the work to not be such a creepy, obsessive shithead towards women. Just leave them alone. Or at least have the goddamn honesty within yourself to know that for whatever you think is your desperation for companionship, just like Tesfaye after that night with Anima, by the next morning, once you get laid, you're suddenly gonna wake up as if from a dream and be like, oh wow, okay, I got my off. Okay, I'm going back to doing my thing later. And what did you do to her? She said what you did. Did you hit her? Did you assault her? At least have the stones in this movie to show not just the horrible things you say to women, but what you do to them. You aren't lonely. You just want to get pussy because, like drugs and alcohol and money, it's this thing that you put on a pedestal as this thing that gives you that shallow validation that you crave but don't need, and your obsession with your own desires to the exclusion of everything else leads you to being a bad person who abuses women. I fully understand why so much of the consensus seems to be to write off this movie. It does come off as, in many ways, again, almost like a self-inflicted work of character assassination on Tesfaye's part. But this isn't just Tesfaye's movie. It's a collaboration with an honestly perfectly selected filmmaking collaborator for this kind of project, who has seemingly successfully turned this opportunity to work with one of the most high-profile male celebrities on the f***ing planet to create the most successful and most horrifying psychological portrait since his very 2015 debut. This may not be a movie you like, but Hurry Up Tomorrow is pretty apparently not made to be liked. It is made to inspire a mood of stress and even indignation and righteous offense taken to the persona of the real person it serves as a self-portrait for. And to that extent, it is perhaps one of the most incendiary and radical works of music cinema, especially cinema that is a companion piece to the star artist's work, that any mainstream audience is likely to see. I understand the dismissive reaction to Hurry Up Tomorrow to a certain extent, but I still think it constitutes a really important artistic achievement for our times because of what it starkly renders as the abhorrent hypocrisy in how contemporary men are treated for their worst behavior, and moreover, how they treat and coddle and nurse themselves, even hiding behind a patina of convenient self-help and therapeutic talk to facilitate a nihilistic recursion into them just going back and being the exact same shallow, manipulative, superficial, and abusive people they desire to be for their own validation. Hurry Up Tomorrow is an aesthetically exceptional, deeply disturbing window into the heart of toxic masculinity, and potentially into the mind of one of the biggest pop stars of our generation. I'm giving it a 4 out of 5. With that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for sticking through this review, and don't be afraid to sound off in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.